people in my department. Literally, someone said, today, I'm particularly pleased to introduce our speaker today, with Christine Harrison, who has just received her doctorate from the Department of Curriculum and Instruction here at UW. And Christine has a very fascinating trajectory in that she has basically looked at the world through different eyes than those that most of us look at it through. And in that search for the world through different eyes, she actually happened to find a niche in the island of Puerto Rico, where she moved to several years ago, as she was still doing her doctoral work here. And there she found that there's a very contentious issue regarding the imprint, the legacy, the presence, the present day importance or significance of the Taino Indians and of indigeneity more generally. What does it mean to have a society where most people through time have denied that the Amerindian culture actually survived the conflict? And this is something that has become rather contentious over recent years as people have recognized that that's not perhaps what happened. That in fact there's a lot more to that story than meets the eye. And Christine decided to look at it from the standpoint of how this is taught through the school systems and how it's incorporated into the curriculum and so on and so forth. And her research provides some interesting insights into that issue, but also insights into how you can reincorporate it into a curriculum that is more attentive to what's happening on the ground with people's awareness of their indigenous past. Okay? So with that, I'm very glad to introduce you, Christine Harrison.
Well, thank you very much for coming. And my first couple pictures were beautiful pictures of the beach and the El Yunque rainforest. And like Professor Scarano said, I lived in Puerto Rico for a year a while ago, and then for the last 2.5 years. And another thing I wanted to say about my time living there is that I had 2 parallel experiences with the school system. Can everybody hear me okay? My voice isn't too low? Okay, I had 2 parallel experiences with the school system. And one is that I was studying the school system. I did my proposal to study this topic, but I also had my kids in the school system. And they're 13 and 15. And they're the reason I'm back in Madison, because the school system has a lot of problems, and they didn't learn Spanish. And so while my PhD work, I defend the Puerto Rican school system, I defend teachers, I defend education, even though I'm looking at it politically. Personally, I have critiques of it, so I keep those 2 things separate. Anyway, this is just a picture in the mountains. That's a highway that you could find on a highway map, and from when I was driving around to interview teachers. This is the title. My title is Mapping Language Education Policy and Educational Imperialism, U.S. Schooling the Indigenous Element in Boriken, Puerto Rico. And I did this in curriculum and instruction, like you said. I used the word mapping. Well, I'll talk about the word mapping in a little bit. It's about governing and playing on words with the word map. But the U.S. schooling part, schooling is, I'm using it as a verb here because it's about U.S. The imposition of the school system. And I do use the work of Ivan Illich. I don't know if a lot of people realize that he spent some time and quite a bit of time with Puerto Ricans and in Puerto Rico. And first he was with the church, and then he had educational thinking. And his words are really, or his work is really strong Now he critiques education as an institution and how it manufactures demand and perpetuates poverty. So, I mean, there's a lot to him. I can't go into all of that now, but the study is about, as Professor Scott said, like what schools teach kids about themselves. It's about Puerto Rican identity as well as the indigenous part, but it's how schools end up teaching kids who they are. And this is actually, it relates a lot to history. I mean, it's the teaching of history in schools, and history not just in the sense of history is stuff that happened in the past, but when part of history is teaching students who they are or what they are. Like, and for Native Americans and indigenous people, and even for immigrants, this is a really big issue. So my research question was about the role of schooling and teaching this. More specifically, it's language education policy, which is a field and an interpretive frame, which I'll explain in a minute. I'm not really talking about Tainos. That's popularly, or that's the way most people think of the indigenous of Puerto Rico, but since there's a huge neo-Taino movement, and there's a lot of different groups, and they don't all agree, and there's a lot of kind of weird stuff out there about Tainos, and since the image of the Taino gets rather simplified in the books and the way it's taught, I just kind of avoid that word. That's not really what I'm talking about.
Can you tell us what that means?
Oh, Taino is the name given to the original inhabitants that met Columbus.
Oh, okay.
And
Sorry.
I'll talk about that in a minute, but Puerto Ricans are taught that they're this harmonious, kind of democratic racial mix that's kind of like a neat, you know, 3 parts. And these pictures, by the way, I've got dozens of them scanned. They always show up differently. A lot of times the indigenous person looks kind of stupid or weird, or they're on the bottom, or the Spanish is on the top, or, you know, this is actually a rather beautiful picture that's from a 4th grade book, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, so the Tainos are the, you know, the name given to the presumed extinct original inhabitants of the island when the Spanish got there. Okay, so the historical reference base that I used a body of knowledge that's not the official. I know the word official, there isn't exactly an official history. I mean, by official, I mean what is taught in schools typically and what is just presumed to be the case. There's another body of knowledge that by a few different people, and for example, Juan Manuel Delgado Colon, he's one person, he did decades of oral history all across the island, and he found the indigenous past a couple generations back rather than 16 generations back. In the version of his, you know, the different versions of history, like the coast, and like in these maps you can see this is Old San Juan, you know, and later I have another map, but Old San Juan is really small, and it was a walled city, and then there was the rest of the island, which is mountains. And then he talks about the censuses that didn't count and couldn't count everybody because there's a lot of valleys and caves, and then he reread the documents. Then there's other people who did work, like Tony Castagna did work on the jibaros. Jibaros are, it's also a concept that's used for the people in the mountains or in the countryside. He was a 4th generation jibaro in Hawaii who was questioning his own family because he had learned that his family is Spanish and Indian. So he started investigating, and he ended up going back to Puerto Rico. He's like younger than me, I think, and he interviewed a lot of people, and there's people with, you know, traditions, and they, you know, different, the way they live and the way they consider it. So anyways, then there's Lynn Guitar. She's done work in Dominican Republic, and Jose Barrero has done work in Cuba about the same issues of indigenous survival in the Caribbean. And I'll probably mention this again later, but it's not trying to claim, none of them are trying to say that there's some lost tribe out in the forest and that people are, there's people who are 100% blood quantum living out in the forest and those people survived. It's not that. It's just as part of the mix, which, what kind of importance to give it and what kind of a history is it. And in a minute I'll show you the version that's taught in the schools. So this is actually a family. I didn't meet a lot of people because I was dealing with the school system and the curriculum and the teachers, but I did meet this family and this, she's grown up, but you can see what they look like and they still do traditional stuff and they consider themselves indigenous and not Taino. They don't say we're Taino, they just have this way of life. So here's the school version, okay? So instead of what I just mentioned, which is kind of a rich history and more continuity, survival of culture through the Jibaros, this is what is taught in schools. Basically, this is just a page from a 4th grade book, but it kind of sums up the Taino people were pretty much all gone by like 1550 or so, and they were either sick or they were converting to Christianity or they were fleeing the island. So I have a lot of different skins like that, not in the slides, but I had all the books. So this is pretty much what kids are taught in school, okay? They're just taught that 500 years ago, there were these people who lived there, and then somehow for 500 years, certain little things existed, like the word hammock, or Puerto Ricans are pretty friendly because the Taino were friendly, or some kind of just really reduced stuff like that. So that's basically what the kids learn. So in order to make this, a research study, and the way I designed the study is that I didn't want to go out and interview people or try to talk for Puerto Ricans or try to talk for indigenous people or anything like that. So I did a policy analysis under the umbrella of interpretive policy. So what I did is I just, I looked at like federal policies. I guess I could use this pointer, but I looked at federal policies and Puerto Rican level policies in language and education. And then I looked at the curriculum, including the standards and textbooks. I did 4th and 7th grade. I'll talk about that in a second. And then because the policies kind of translate into the curriculum, and then that translates into teaching, what the teachers know and what they believe, but also what they have to teach, because they have to follow certain standards. And then all of those together kind of equal students' knowledge and identity formation. So that's kind of my research design. So there it is again up there. My methodology is indigenous methodology, which I'll talk about in a minute. Kind of a chain of analysis. So again, the policies kind of express the power and ideology. And again, these are federal, like U.S. policies. And then I chose 4th and 7th grade because they have to learn Puerto Rican history in 4th grade and 7th grade, and again in 10th. And that, interestingly, is from the Organic Law of 1990. Says that they have to learn 1 year of Puerto Rican history at each level. And it's really weird because in the 1999 version of the law, it doesn't say that, but they're still doing it. Unless I missed it somewhere, I couldn't find it. But I also chose Spanish and social studies because even though everybody said, no, it's just social studies that would teach this, since I'm using language education policy, which I'll describe in a second, my view is that integrating the subjects makes sense, and that in a Spanish classroom, since they're learning language and vocabulary and they're reading literature, it's a very easy place to teach history and identity. And so then I looked at the standards, and then I interviewed teachers. Okay, so this is I'm just going to show a couple maps really quick. This is just a map of the places where I did interviews. So this is Puerto Rico. Here's the little Old San Juan. My daughter drew these, and I went to these. These are all the municipalities. She drew in the barrios, for each one. These are the ones I went to that are drawn in. And then here's another map I made. So I unfortunately was living here, and then I went out here, and this is all mountains. So this is just something I made with like the names. If anybody has ever studied the names of Puerto Rican towns and the barrios and the sectores, somebody actually did a PhD on that at the Centro de Estudios Avanzados in San Juan. It's really interesting because a lot of the names are indigenous names, so they're everywhere. Anyways, I'm just going to go back a little bit to the word mapping. I mean, you all probably know, of course, know where Puerto Rico is, and one of the things that people always say is that Puerto Rico is so small, and I got really sick of hearing that because it's relatively small, you know? I mean, when you're going out in the mountains or the road, or you're going to walk, it's not small at all. So if you look at, these are the rivers, and I'm pretty sure there's 1,200 inlets, and this is all mountains. You see that? There's really, and then with all these municipalities and barrios, there's really a lot of different places. So it's really, there's a lot of potential for different people to be in different places, you know, and some of them could be immigrants, some of them would be from wherever, and this is just how I looked at it. This is Paul Miller's map. I'll come back to Paul Miller a little bit later. But, so, now I'm just going to go back to explain the language education policy as a field. This map is Puerto Rico. You can see the 78 municipalities, and the colors are the different educative regions. So that's how it's divided into educative regions. There's about 1,500 schools. There's less than that now because they keep closing. I think 2 years ago they closed 75. This year they closed a bunch more. They're saying they're going to close like 500 more. Yesterday I read that like 56,000 professionals and 250,000 poor people have left Puerto Rico since 2006. So this is a really big issue, but maybe we can talk about that later. But this is about governing language and education. So basically as a field, it's about standardizing the language and building schools, standardizing content of what is knowledge, and then how those are both governed.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but since you have the map on the board, I just wanted to know, why did you confine your research to the north and northwest and didn't do the other areas?
I'm so glad you asked that because I forgot to say. The people who, well, the place out in this area is called La Indiera, and that's where there's more less population, and that's where most historians agree on both sides of the camp that it was the last refuge of the indigenous people, like as the Spaniards, you know, through the centuries. There's this big area out here called La Indiera. I forgot to say that. So some people claim that out towards the west and in the mountains, there was more. And interestingly, when they did the DNA study, which I'll talk about later, apparently 80% of the people out in the west have the mitochondrial DNA. And so anyways, that was just the area. So I just decided to go out to those areas that are more remote and which was, you know, kind of in the romantic past of where they should have survived longer. Even though, like Professor Carraro's from Macau over here, there's no reason why there couldn't have been people out here in the rainforest. They could have been everywhere. So, sorry.
I just wondered, just to put what you said a minute ago in context of how many schools are closing, et cetera, people leaving the island, like what's the overall population of the island? Oh yeah, it was on that other slide. It was around 4 million. Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I just put too much on the slide. but it was around 4 million. I don't know if it was ever much higher, but now it's
No,
3.5.
3.9 million was the highest, and it's now to 3.5, 3.6.
Yeah.
So how many much what?
But as people flee, some come back. So
Okay.
it's really
Yeah.
the
It's kind of staying
remainder.
on a.
It's the balance of
Yeah.
migration.
I know people go and then people come back, but there is, you know, a bad economic crisis. That's kind of like a perpetual thing that seems like it's always happening there, but that was just something that I happened to read yesterday. Like, it was in Facebook. I didn't even know it was a good source. But in any case, everybody says that a lot of people have been leaving and whatever. I mean, anyways, okay. So, the issue about governing the language, just to explain, is that, well, okay, before I get too far into this, there's two issues here. I'm talking about the U.S. imposing schooling, okay? And so in 1898, when they got there, there's a whole bunch of stuff that started to happen. And then, but I couldn't do this study about 130 years or 118 years, about 118 years of schooling and 118 years of teaching and curriculum. So I point out some of these things that happened in the beginning because it was the imposition of U.S. schooling, and then I kind of look at now more in detail. So I hope that makes sense. But so this is a little bit more historical still. I mean, the U.S. imposed a monolingual ideology. There were, I mean, dozens of quotes I found about how Americans said Puerto Ricans spoke such bad Spanish that it was barely even Spanish, that they might as well just learn English because the Spanish is so bad and stuff like that. You know, there were years of trying to impose English in different domains for a while in the schools. It just oscillated back and forth. But as far as Spanish and variations of Spanish, that's a whole field of study, a whole field of, you know, and of course there are linguists who have studied that, but, you know, some people said there was a special Jibaro language that the people spoke between themselves. There are people who documented indigenous languages in oral history, but usually this part is just left out. The indigenous language, there are linguists, some of the main linguists, who say that in the early 20th century there were still people who spoke. And then this is a teacher, this is Juan Manuel Delgado, they also documented it. Teachers used to say that the biggest problem with kids, and this is throughout all different years of history books, that the kids would come to school and they wouldn't understand them and they had all these words that they didn't know. Even some of the teachers I interviewed said that, especially the older ones, that kids would come and they would have all these words they didn't know. So the point here is just that language got standardized to Spanish. And then which indigenous language it might be, if somebody was going to study that, most people say it's Arawak, which is from South America, but there's another group of people who say that it's Maya Yucateca. So that's another whole field of study that I think. But anyway, Spanish definitely became an identity between the language and as the heritage, and that's a really complex issue vis-a-vis Americanization. So this is, again, I already said most of it, but it's just an education analysis of U.S. imposed schooling. So as far as putting it into a big picture of Latin America and then educational imperialism, if somebody's studying U.S. imperialism in the Caribbean and Latin America, in a lot of places that I read, a lot of people say that the imperialism of Puerto Rico was democratic, beneficial, that it was like a kind imperialism, and it was often justified through education because they said that everybody was illiterate, whatever. And then this is just an old picture. This person wrote about the Americanization through the school system. And but the school system definitely, especially in the beginning, was teaching patriotism to the United States and U.S. values, and then, but there was a racial hierarchy. But of course, there was a lot of resistance, and Puerto Ricans resisted. Everybody probably knows a lot. There was a lot of cultural resistance, and they thought. I'm just going to skip that. As far as my study, I'm sorry, I think I'm talking too much. But these were my 4 starting points. Maybe it's kind of late to be saying these are starting points, but that's all background. But when I looked at the policies and the language education policy, I'll just call these 4 points, not starting points. Okay, so Native Americans and Puerto Ricans got the same ideology imposed on them through schooling. And I'll talk about the Native American thing in a minute. I used the survival literature. I already talked about that. Okay, I already talked about this, that there were 2 different, there's 2 different kinds of histories. And then as far as talking about the first generation, a lot is when that's when the school system came, and then a lot of people had to migrate, and the people that stayed had to go to schools. So that's kind of where I'm starting with. The boarding school ideology, this is really important because at the time when Puerto Rico was invaded, the U.S. Was educating Native Americans in boarding schools rather than killing them and taking them away. So they used illiteracy as a justification to assimilate kids, take away their language, and they wanted to, education administrators wanted to extinguish the cultures and get rid of the language and teach them inferiority. So this same ideology for Native Americans was used in Puerto Rico. This picture is, it's a really bad scan. I'm sorry. This is Sosire del Moral's book. It looks much nicer, of course. And she wrote about the cultural politics of schools in Puerto Rico. So it was the same kind of ideology. So then it was progressive schooling. It was progressive schooling, progressive education that was going on here. That's what they were doing to Native Americans. That immigrants had to go to school, learn English. It puts the burden on kids to negotiate their identity between what they have at home and what they learn in school. So as far as the indigenous question, I already mentioned about the blood quantum, but I'm not talking about blood quantum. I'm talking about their outlook and their identity. So this was my question about schooling the indigenous element. In Puerto Rico, this is just a map of the indigenous names. This is a map from a book of what kids would learn, of where the caciques lived, and this would be 500 years ago. So I used indigeneity as a conceptual frame. I think I'm just going to skip over this because I'm talking too much. But this is just the conceptual frame that I used, which was trying to use an indigenous perspective on things rather than a Western Eurocentric frame. So indigenous methodology, it's more about relational ontology, things being connected, language and education and knowledge being integrated and not just rule governed, not just a set of knowledge or pieces of information that are learned in school, but a way of life. I'm probably not doing it justice in just a moment, but
You have plenty of time too.
yeah, I know. I was trying to not talk so much. So does anybody have any questions? Am I talking really fast? Or?
We have till 1, so.
Yeah, I know. But I was hoping people would ask stuff. So I'll try to get to the end and then go back. But I just chose the indigenous framework as part of the research design because it just fit with looking at education for indigenous children in the United States, and then that same ideology being transplanted to Puerto Rico, and then trying to imagine what the people and the kids were like then. It was just the most appropriate way to look at it. This is another kind of explanation of the indigenous framework. It's just trying to use concepts from their point of view. There's an interdependence between things. There's multiple realities. This is a really important thing, which is the connection between the knowledge and the land and the language. And that really comes up if you think about the language in Puerto Rico and the language that different languages that might have been spoken. But what also is important is how to know, because it's often said that Spanish documents are authentic because they're written
I don't know people in my department. Literally, someone said, "Sí, cuenta y pico," no? Today, I'm particularly pleased to introduce our speaker, speaker today, Christine Harrison, who has just received her doctorate from the Department of Curriculum and Instruction here at UW. And Christine has a very fascinating trajectory in that she has basically looked at the world through different eyes than those that most of us look at it through. And in that search for the world through different eyes, she actually happened to find a niche in the island of Puerto Rico, where she moved to several years ago, as she was still doing her doctoral work here. And there she found that there's a very contentious issue regarding the imprint, the legacy, the presence, the present day importance or significance of the Taino Indians and of indigeneity more generally. What does it mean to have a society where most people through time have denied that the Amerindian culture actually survived the conflict? And this is something that has become rather contentious over recent years as people have recognized that that's not perhaps what happened. That in fact there's a lot more to that story than meets the eye. And Christine decided to look at it from the standpoint of how this is taught through school systems and how it's incorporated into the curriculum and so on and so forth. And her research provides some interesting insights.
I'll talk about the word mapping in a little bit. It's about governing and playing on words with the word map. But the U.S. schooling part, schooling is, I'm using it as a verb here because it's about U.S. The imposition of the school system. And I do use the work of Ivan Illich. I don't know if a lot of people realize that he spent some time and quite a bit of time with Puerto Ricans and in Puerto Rico. And first he was with the church, and then he had educational thinking. And his words are really, or his work is really strong. Now he critiques education as an institution and how it manufactures demand and perpetuates poverty. So, I mean, there's a lot to him. I can't go into all of that now, but the study is about, as Professor Scott said, like what schools teach kids about themselves. It's about Puerto Rican identity as well as the indigenous part, but it's how schools end up teaching kids who they are. And this is actually, it relates a lot to history. I was studying the school system. I did my proposal to study this topic, but I also had my kids in the school system, and they're 13 and 15. And they're the reason I'm back in Madison, because the school system has a lot of problems, and they didn't learn Spanish. And so while my PhD work, I defend the Puerto Rican school system, I defend teachers, I defend education, even though I'm looking at it politically. Personally, I have critiques of it, so I keep those two things separate. Anyways, this is just a picture in the mountains. That's a highway that you could find on a highway map, and from when I was driving around to interview teachers. This is the title. My title is Mapping Language Education Policy and Educational Imperialism, U.S. Schooling the Indigenous Element in Boriken, Puerto Rico. And I did this in curriculum and instruction, like you said. I used the word mapping. Well,
that issue, but also insights into how you can reincorporate it into a curriculum that is more attentive to what's happening on the ground with people's awareness of their indigenous past. Okay? So with that, I'm very glad to introduce you, Christine Harrison.
Well, thank you very much for coming. And my first couple pictures were beautiful pictures of the beach and the El Yunque rainforest. And like Professor Scarano said, I lived in Puerto Rico for a year a while ago, and then for the last 2.5 years. And another thing I wanted to say about my time living there is that I had 2 parallel experiences with the school system. Can everybody hear me okay? My voice isn't too low? Okay, I had 2 parallel experiences with the school system. And one is that